Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you again to talk about English as a medium of instruction. My name is Jennifer Euler from the Regional English Language Office that works with the U.S. Embassy and Consulates in Brazil. And it's my great pleasure to welcome this second webinar in our series about English as a medium of instruction. Tonight, we will be focusing on writing content and language outcomes for an EMI instructional unit and how those outcomes shape assessment in the EMI classroom. We're here together with our English language specialist, as well as our host for this program, our partner from CCBO Sorocaba and FACENS, Noemi Fontal. And I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker so we can get to work and get to learning. Julianne Hammock, our English language specialist, is the Instructional Design and Development Coordinator at the Center for English as a Second Language at the University of Arizona. She develops courses and teaching materials for English instruction and teacher training. She has an MA in linguistics from the University of Texas at El Paso and an MA in second language acquisition and teaching from the University of Arizona. This is her second webinar, and we really look forward to learning from her tonight. If you have questions during the webinar, please put them in the chat box, and we will be stopping periodically and at the end to answer your questions. So over to you, Julianne. We look forward to learning and enjoy the webinar, everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Noemi. Good afternoon or good evening, as the case may be for you. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started. So, as Jennifer said, today we are going to kind of continue the backward design process. And last week we talked a little bit about how we conceptualize EMI. And so at the beginning of the planning, we have to think about who our students are and what our programs are like and what we want our students to be able to accomplish in English, in EMI, and in the content area at the end of the program. So today we're going to move on to writing learning outcomes. And as Jennifer said, this is linked to assessment because in the backward design process, the first thing that you need to do is identify what you want students to be able to do at the end, and those are outcomes. And then you want to think about how will I know that they've learned those things, and that's assessment. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, the slides are available to you. You should be able to see those in the comments or the chat window on Facebook, and the slides are also available here. So you're welcome to follow along. There are some links that are clickable for you, and this might be a resource for you to use as you go about your planning for your EMI programs. And today we're going to start by talking about what teachers know. And this isn't directly related to writing outcomes, but it's a way of thinking about what's involved with writing outcomes, especially in something like English medium instruction, where we've got so many things going on in the classroom and in the planning stages. We're just going to take a look at what those things are. And it's going to start to build a case for this interdisciplinary collaboration that I keep repeating in my webinars and my talks. And so we'll talk about pedagogical content knowledge and that model, which was by Schulman. And then we'll move on to writing outcomes. We'll start with a general discussion of good strategies and good practices for writing any learning outcome. And then we're going to move in specifically to writing language outcomes. I'll admit I'm going to give a little short shrift here to writing content outcomes. Unfortunately, we have an hour, and I think that my expertise is in the language domain, where if you're a professor who's going to be offering instruction in an EMI program, then your expertise is in content instruction. And so the principles for writing good learning outcomes are the same for writing content or writing language outcomes. And so you can apply these principles to the content area of the outcome writing process also. And we'll spend a very short amount of time talking about how outcomes inform what we do in assessment. So we know that the backward design model, we begin with what we want our students to know. And then we start to think about how we're going to know that they've learned those things. And in backward design, the summative assessment or the culminating assessment of an instructional unit is often a task that students have to carry out. So it's a performative task. They've actually got to do something somewhat authentic that incorporates a lot of different skills and knowledge. And so we'll start to look at that in a very short way, but we do have a complete webinar on assessment, and that will be coming up, I believe, in week 5 of this series. So what do teachers know? When we become teachers, I know it was true of me my first year in the classroom. I was a little bit at sea about how to integrate all the things that I knew I needed to be doing. And Schulman had similar questions about what do teachers know and how does that guide what they do in practice in the classroom? Any kind of teacher, any professor, any teacher of young children in early childhood programs. We got to know where teacher explanations come from. They appear, we use them, but how do we create them? How do we decide how we're going to present content to students? And how do all these different domains and these things that we've got to account for in our classroom, how do we integrate them in a way that's comprehensible to students? And Schulman's model is generally called the pedagogical content knowledge model. And Schulman makes the argument that content knowledge by itself, just knowing the academic field, isn't sufficient for instructing other people in the content, in the principles of your field and the knowledge of your field. Somehow you've got to take that content and you've got to put it in a form that people can take in and comprehend and integrate into what they already know. And so mere content knowledge by itself, he says, is about as useless pedagogically as content-free skill. Imagine riding a bike with no bike. So, and the question is, how do we get there? How do we get other teachers there if we're in roles where we train teachers to be professionals? And Schulman laid out a series of areas of things teachers know. So teachers know content, the content that they've been trained to teach. They know things about what it means to teach. How do we teach in a very just kind of isolated way? What is teaching? Curriculum knowledge. So we all teach in a context. We all have a curriculum, either concrete or just agreed upon generally, that we work with. And then we have a combination of some of these things. We have a combination of knowing what it means to teach and how to do it, and knowing what the content of the field is. And where those things intersect or overlap, we can call that content area or pedagogical content knowledge. So we also know things about our learners and the context that we're teaching in, what our institutions are like, what the mandates of our institution are, and even more general things about what the purpose of education is. Why do we teach? What values do we have as teachers in education? And what is our educational philosophy? So that's a lot of stuff to bring together into a form that's going to be useful for students. And Schulman's initial outline of the pedagogical content knowledge model was that it was the overlap between what you know about your content and what you know about teaching. It's that intersection that's important. And so we can visualize it as a Venn diagram here with PCK is the acronym that we use for that, being in the middle. But it isn't always that simple. So when you have that overlap, that PCK, it isn't simply content plus teaching knowledge. Schulman calls it a special amalgam. So it's something transformative that happens when you learn how to do those two things together. And he says that this is what distinguishes an expert in a content area from a teacher of that content area. So it's something special that emerges and develops as you become a professional educator. It makes you different from just a simple content expert. I don't want to denigrate content experts, but this is something that's in addition to that. So the PCK model has been applied to very heavily in the area of STEM education and people who study how STEM teachers, science teachers, engineering, mathematics teachers, how they conceptualize and deliver instruction to their students. And so it's a model that you'll see a great deal in that literature. It has been extended to language education as well, not to the degree, I think, as it is in STEM. And it's also been pretty widely extended to teaching with technology. And teachers who use technology in education have a form of pedagogical content knowledge that includes knowledge of technology and how that can be integrated into learning. Also, one thing I wanted to note is that if you're following along on the slides, in the speaker notes, often there are links to additional sources. So you can follow those as well if you'd like more information. But here we have a technological pedagogical content knowledge model. And you see that again, it's the intersection between what you know about technology and how you apply it to teaching and teaching of a particular content area. It's the intersection that matters because something happens when those three domains of knowledge interact with each other. And so Tpck or Tpac, it's called sometimes, you'll see that a great deal in the literature, and it's a model that's been used a great deal. What hasn't been used to such an extent is the idea of a language pedagogical content knowledge model, where you know the content, you know general instructional practice, and you also know language and how language works. And a language specialist, someone trained in this, may have developed LPCK or language PCK, but anyone can develop it as part of paying attention to how language works, maybe collaborating with people who have that as their field. And the same is also true from the other point of view. As language specialists and language instructors, we can benefit from how content instructors go about delivering content in their area. So we can develop content knowledge and content PCK also. And one of the goals of this series of webinars and series of workshops is to do this. It's to spend more time, because I'm a language specialist, I'm going to focus people's attention on what language does in the classroom and how language is used and how we can draw students' attention to it and help them develop their proficiency and their range of capabilities in a language that's not their dominant language. And so from that, we're going to go back to backward design. And I want to remind you that we're still on stage one. We're still on the stage where we want to identify what students should know when they leave our classroom. And so this is where we develop the goals and the outcomes for our lessons, our units, and our courses. And at a macro level for the design of EMI programs at an institution. Later on, we're going to move to the second stage, which is determining how we know that they've learned those things. But for right now, we're still at stage one of the backward design model. And we're faced with a challenge. So there's an enormous amount that students could learn and should learn about any topic at a higher education level, secondary level, even primary level. And as teachers, as program administrators, it's our job to focus that and to choose the things that we think will help our students the most. And so Wiggins and McTeague, in their Understanding by Design book, they suggest ways of doing that, of narrowing down what we could teach to the things that are most important. And they distinguish knowledge and skills and things into three basic scopes, I guess. So there are things that it's good to know casually, things about our field that it's, it would be helpful for students to know. worth knowing is what they call it, worth being familiar with. That's the big circle. And then there is a set of knowledge and skills that it's important for the students in our courses to be able to master and to be able to apply. Things that they need, and if they don't have them, they're not going to be successful in the course or in their career, if their career involves the content you're teaching. And then there are things that are so essential to what you're teaching that we call them enduring understanding. That's what Wiggins and McTeague call it. But I would say that this is the stuff that you want students to remember after they've left your class and maybe forgotten what they studied for the final exam, things that remain with them that keep them successful as they go about their careers in that field. So that core knowledge and skills is what we want to make sure that we cover. The important stuff we also want to cover to the degree that it's possible. And then more incidental learning, those teachable moments, that might be the widest circle of things that are worth being familiar with. And Wiggins and McTeague suggest some filters, some questions we can ask to identify what is important. What is stuff that we think is core knowledge as opposed to things that are just nice for the students to know. And the first question that they say we should ask ourselves is what ideas, topics, and processes are most valuable outside of the classroom. So when students go out to their careers or apply their knowledge outside the classroom, what are the things that would be most important in that situation? Okay, and then we also need to consider within our disciplines. This is when content knowledge and knowing our own academic fields is important. What is core and fundamental to the disciplines in which we teach? And the third one is what are the ideas, topics, processes that are most prone to misconceptions, maybe the most confusing for students? And Wiggins and McTeague call this things that require uncoverage, things that require some maybe focused teaching because students do have misunderstandings or misconceptions about them, or they're difficult to acquire for one reason or another. And so we focus on things that require the teaching, and those things should be explicitly addressed in our course, in our instructional units. And finally, what are the ideas and the processes and the topics that are going to engage students? Now, in an ideal world, everything would engage students, and possibly in another ideal world, we can figure out ways to make anything engaging for students. But we do need to realize that the students are a participant in the instructional process, in the learning process. And if you're doing your half, but students haven't engaged, they might not be doing the things that they could do to maximize their learning. So we want to consider what engages students. And for the EMI context, we want to consider both content and language for each of these. So again, that adds a dimension to our planning and to our instruction. And we want to distinguish between something that's a goal, a learning goal for a class, and something that's an objective, and we can even call these, that's an outcome. Outcomes are the things that go on our lesson plans, but a goal might be a program goal, it might be a course goal. It's a little bit more general. So an example of a learning goal for an American history course, a US history course, would be students will develop a broader knowledge of US American history. They'll develop a broader knowledge. You can see how broad that is. And you can see how just addressing a goal like that could be the content for an entire 16 weeks of instruction on a semester. But if you focus it, you can identify particular things within that goal that can be taught in your lessons and in your instructional units. So students will be able to describe the timeline of colonization of the Americas by the British, the French, and the Spanish. So they're able to describe a timeline. That's a really specific thing you can visualize them doing. And when they're doing it, you can see them doing it. And you can plan a lesson about how to organize a timeline and how to use that timeline to describe this process. And when we write language objectives, we want to make sure that we have a few characteristics in our outcomes. So I need to consistently use the word outcomes here because that's the way I've used it in my talk. So you need to consider your audience. Usually that's your students. We have a formula when we write learning outcomes. Students will be able to, SWBAT. And you know, we always want to keep in mind that we're teaching students, and those students have characteristics, and we need to keep those in mind when we write our language outcomes or our content outcomes. We need to identify a behavior that we want to observe in our students. And we use a verb to do this, and I'm sure you're well acquainted with Bloom's taxonomy and the lists of verbs that accompany Bloom's taxonomy, and they're very handy and very useful for writing learning outcomes, and because they identify behaviors. And then the third thing we want to include in our outcomes is features of the outcome. So more concrete information about what their behavior is going to result in, or what the product should look like. And also outcomes can also include the degree to which they're able to do this particular thing. Can they do it with 100% mastery? Are they able to do it consistently? So degree of attainment or level of attainment might be something also included in complete and well-developed learning outcome. So I was taught a formula in teacher school, and this formula has kind of followed me throughout my career as I've changed the places that I teach and the students that I teach, but it is pretty solid and pretty reliable. And the formula is students will be able to verb, that's your behavior that you're identifying, and then noun would be some kind of product or some kind of genre or some kind of concrete entity in a particular measurable detail. And so here we have a few examples for content and for language. For content, we could have something like students will be able to create and label correctly a bar graph that represents data from the class survey. So short sentence, a great deal of work is going on in here. So students will be creating a bar graph. That's an entire lesson or a week of lessons, depending on what students already know about that particular process. Label a bar graph, identify the characteristics of any particular kind of bar chart. We know that bar charts have titles, they have axes, they have a key, they have labels, they have scales. So all of that is stuff that students, if they don't have it from previous education, it needs to go into your lesson. And data from a class survey, that implies that there's been a class survey done, which also implies that there has been instruction on how to gather data, how to design a survey. So a very small little sentence, and we can infer from it a great deal of instruction that has to happen. For language, we have the same kind of situation. If we're in an EMI classroom or a CLIL classroom, and we're working with bar graphs in whatever content is the content of the lesson, students will be able to explain to a partner. So you already have an observable behavior. You actually have a context. They'll be able to explain it to someone else as opposed to possibly an audience or to a general population. They'll be able to explain to a partner what the bar graph shows. So they'll be able to interpret the bar graph using linguistic features that we use to talk about data in diagrams and charts and graphs. And then here I've specified measurable detail and identifiable things that we will teach. For example, phrases related to correlation. to samples, to bias, probability, outliers. So that language could be taught in conjunction with the content objective. And it even provides like a STEM phrase that students can use to build upon when they're describing their bar graph. So those are just two examples that actually I've provided the source there. And they give us a little idea about how a language outcome and a content outcome might be developed in conjunction with one another. And they build upon each other and they can support each other. Other things to think about when we develop our outcomes are they should be specific as possible. If you're writing a series of learning outcomes for an instructional unit, you know that you have a limited amount of time. And so you should write your outcomes to fit within the amount of time that you're planning for. So something that's as general as a learning goal that we saw wouldn't be adequate for planning an instructional unit or a lesson. They should be measurable. You should be able to, it should be something you should be able to see students do or somehow document that they are doing. They should be able to demonstrate that they can do it because you use your outcomes to assess. And if it's some kind of internal process that the students really can't do externally, it'll be extremely difficult to assess. They should be attainable, so don't overplan. I'm very guilty of overplanning lessons, overplanning courses, but you need to remember that you're working within some constraints of time, of resources, maybe of student capabilities. So you make sure that they're attainable, make sure that they're relevant to the students. That means if it's a language outcome, it should be a language outcome written at the level where the students, you know, the zone of proximal development, the place where students are going to advance to next linguistically. So if we want to think about it in a very general way, Common European Framework has A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. If your students are A2, you might be writing outcomes that are aligned to an A2 or early B1 level of language proficiency. So it should be based on where your students are and where they need to go next. And also relevant to your course, of course, relevant to your program. Sometimes you've got a written curriculum and you need to work within those boundaries. And also time bound. So time bound means you write objectives that can be accomplished in a semester or accomplished in a week of instruction or accomplished in one class session. So you have to work within boundaries. Now let's apply those two sets of criteria to a couple example outcomes that I found. Actually, you can find the source in the speaker notes down here. But the one on the left, it's a little small, says upon completion of this unit. So they've bound it in time. Okay, so this, it's bound in time. And students will be able to critically assess, okay, there's our verb, the factors influencing physical activity and nutrition. So environment, they've got some specifics here, community, habits, and analyze how these factors shape their current choices. So in fact, we have two sets of verbs in here. We actually probably have two learning outcomes here that have been kind of combined into one because they're closely related to each other. Then on the right-hand side, we've got upon completion of this unit, students will be able to understand how factors such as the environment and community impact their physical activity and nutrition choices. Now, superficially, these look like they cover the same type of thing. I see someone in chat here. Okay, so superficially, they look pretty similar. But I'm going to call your attention to the verb in the right-hand outcome here, learning outcome 2. And you probably notice that the verb is understand. Now, what does understanding look like when it happens? It's an internal process. And so a student may visually kind of reflect that they're understanding something. You know, you sometimes talk about students, you see the light bulb go off in a student's mind, right? They suddenly go. But we can't count on something like that. So a verb like understand is probably not the kind of behavioral, observable behavior that we want to include in an outcome. And we have some alternatives that are much, much better. So let's continue, and you'll notice that, like I said, understand is not very observable. Now, Potter and Kustra and many other people have suggested that there are verbs that should not be included in writing learning outcomes for this reason. They're not observable. They're internal processes that it's very difficult for us to measure or assess. Understand is at the top of that list. And then they call them the sinister 16. I'm sure there are more than 16, but these verbs, all you can see are things that happen inside someone's head, and very seldom do we have an indication that they're happening. So students know, students grasp, they value something, they appreciate something, they see it or perceive it or get it. They're aware of something, they have a knowledge of something, they're conscious of it, they comprehend it, etc. You can see how those all kind of are similar in the kind of thing that they describe. It's a process that's cognitive, but not necessarily tangible. So they suggest we exclude verbs and phrasal things like this in our outcomes when we write them. So they're internal, you can't observe them and you can't measure them. Now, writing outcomes in Portuguese, you probably semantically have similar verbs, and of course the list is going to be different, but the principle is the same. What we use, and I'm sure you've used these before, are verbs from lists, particularly Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is, I think, predominant in literature related to writing outcomes. It isn't the only taxonomy out there. And I'm going to refer a few times to another taxonomy, which is called Fink's, F-I-N-K. And this is a taxonomy that is designed a little differently, and it's incorporated into a model of course design, particularly for higher education, that is a backward design related model. So it is aligned a little bit more closely with the backward design that we're doing here in these webinars. And so you'll notice that the Fink taxonomy, it's not a hierarchy. And Fink felt very strongly that the domains of knowledge in this hierarchy should kind of interact with each other, that it isn't a process of moving up and up and up and up and up until you get to the top one, which is the most desirable. Fink felt that all of these domains are important in instruction to one degree or another, depending on what you're teaching, right? But you'll notice that there are 3 that are circled. And those 3 kind of relate closely to Wiggins and McTeague and what they describe as the types of learning that we talked about last week. So foundational knowledge, that would be similar to acquiring declarative knowledge in any particular area. Applying that information, so that would be similar to extending the knowledge to new problems that maybe have not been addressed. And then learning how to learn, which is kind of a metacognitive domain, and somehow or somewhat relates to students constructing their own knowledge, which we learned about in backward design last week. And so I do refer to Finks pretty frequently, and I like the idea that the expectation is that several of these be happening at any one time. So I'll refer to this model fairly frequently. Here you see how I understand it to be aligned. So in understanding by design, in the left-hand column, we have students acquire information, or they make meaning, or they transfer it to new situations. And in Finks, students gain factual knowledge or foundational knowledge, then they apply it to new situations, and then they integrate it into something beyond the classroom, something beyond what the lesson covers. And there are, of course, verbs associated with these particular levels. So just like Bloom's, Finks does suggest verbs that apply to each level. You notice that the mixture of verbs is a little bit different between Fink and Bloom. I'm going to pause here before we move on to specifically dealing with language outcomes and see what questions we have from Facebook chat.
Hi, Julie. We have some nice questions, really excellent ones. We have one that is, what is the difference between an objective and an outcome?
That's a good question. I've heard different definitions of those two. Generally, I try to be consistent and use outcome as opposed to goal. And I would have to kind of hedge a little bit and say that there might be people who disagree with that and say that outcomes and objectives are fundamentally different. And if you feel that way, then please kind of explain in Facebook chat what your perspective is. And I would appreciate knowing that.
Okay. And then we have another one. How should language and content be balanced in writing learning outcomes? Is there a good proportion you can recommend?
Yes, I don't think there's a formula. I do think it depends on a lot of factors, including how your program is designed, what the instructors are capable or trained to do as far as language instruction goes, or content instruction. I do think they both need to be present. You need to think about your students. We had a lot of questions last week and in a couple other talks I've given about what level of English proficiency do students need in order to be successful in something like EMI? And like I said last week, we need more research. Makaro and his colleagues agree with that. But I think that we can start small in EMI or even CLIL. So if you're a content instructor, a professor of a particular area, you can start small and incorporate one language objective, English language objective, into your, there you go, I'm using objective and outcome interchangeably, but I don't think they are. But you can incorporate one into your instructional unit or your lesson. And it might be something small, and the majority of the class might be in the dominant language of the students. But there, you can build upon what students bring to the classroom with them. It might not be possible to just immediately begin all English instruction and have, a heavy set of English language or language learning outcomes. But you can start with a couple and then see how students do with that, and then maybe develop as they become more confident, and as you become more confident, increase the percentage or the proportion of language focus.
So we have two more, and this is from Valeria and Antonio. Can you demystify STEM and STEAM? What is the point?
Demystify it?
Uh-huh.
So STEM, as you probably know, is science, technology, engineering, and math. And it's very pragmatic. It's very focused on areas where there's a great deal of growth in industry. And if you add the A, which is arts, and you have the acronym STEAM, you're recognizing that humanities and arts do have a relationship to more technical academic fields, and that students, you can incorporate both of those into instruction in a way that kind of builds their understanding of both of those domains. So I'm not an expert in STEM or STEAM, but it is possibly adding another dimension to something that might exclusively be mathematics, might exclusively be physics. It's a tall order, but I think that there's a lot of merit to considering doing something like STEAM.
Great. And then we have another one. Can we have a quick example of an EMI course to which you might apply this theory?
The theory of, are we talking about learning outcomes?
Yeah,
okay.
I guess so.
Yes, in the second part of this talk, I'm actually going to, it's not going to be a comprehensive example of an EMI program because those are kind of scarce, but I will give examples of outcomes that are written for content-based language instruction, both in content and in language, and that should give us something to start building upon.
Okay.
Cool.
So, thank you.
All right. So let's move on and talk about writing outcomes. Now that we've talked about the characteristics of good learning outcomes, like I said before, I'm going to kind of give short shrift to the content part of this. I think that if you're a professor of physics or professor of business, you are more knowledgeable in that area than I am. So the principles are the same, but I'm going to look more closely at the language aspect of it. So English for specific purposes, ESP up here, those are courses that are intended to prepare people to use English in a very specific domain. Usually it's something professional or something academic or something for the workplace. But courses for EMI usually have a great deal of content in them by necessity. So if it's ESP for STEM, for example, then it's going to incorporate STEM content. And so if we use outcomes from ESP courses that are intended for people learning English to do something very specific, we can get an idea of how we can write outcomes in an EMI class where students also are kind of doing something very specific with English, right? So I kind of gleaned almost at random. I looked for things that seemed to be pretty well written, but I drew from a few different universities, EMI courses. Let's take a look. So the first one is a Swedish university, the KTH Royal Institute of Technology. It's for a technical English class for people whose dominant language is not English, who are going to be working in a technical field. And these are some of the writing outcomes that they've got. So one is write a factual or argumentative report of a technical nature. It's still a little general. It's still not focused on any particular technical field. It's just technical in general. But you have something observable there. Students will be able to write something factual or something argumentative in the form of a report. So there you have a genre. And of course, with a technical focus. Students will be able to summarize texts. So this is almost a comprehension kind of activity. Texts of a general or specialized nature. So they may have a report, and they'll read the technical report, and they'll have to create a summary for that report. And that involves comprehension, reading comprehension. It involves strategies for identifying main ideas and supporting ideas. It may require identifying the argument that's presented in a report. And then you also have write a short description of a technical implement, another type of writing, almost another genre. So it's descriptive writing about something concrete in a technical field. And these courses generally are offered to students from a number of technical fields, and then they're presented the option to focus on something that's within their area of study. So that's usually how these ESP courses will go if the student population is pretty general. So here's another, or this is the same university, but speaking outcomes. So communicate accumulated factual information on topics of personal interest or within the student's field of study. So they're going to talk about information that they're familiar with in English. So that may be in the form of a presentation. It may be in the form of some other kind of project. So they also orally summarize texts in a general or specialized nature, very similar to the writing outcome, and give a formal individual oral presentation. There's a very concrete performative task that might end up being an assessment. Okay, that was one university. Here's another university, it's also Swedish, Kristianstad University, also a technical English class, but in this case it's focused on computer science. So students will be able to choose appropriate styles, forms, register, and vocabulary for an in-class and electronic communication with fellow students and instructors. So discussion board, email, perhaps forum of some kind. So they do have one that's specifically for writing in electronic communication formats. Analyze different types of technical texts, appreciate their specific linguistic and stylistic features. Analyze their own progress is also an outcome of this class. Okay. Yes, my internet connection is very poor today also. So if I freeze, Jennifer is letting me know in chat. And if something is missed and you'd like me to repeat it at the end, just make a note and then I'll try to go back to it. All right. And then USC, University of Southern California's business school, Marshall School of Business, has courses Advanced Writing for Business. And you'll notice that these outcomes are extremely detailed. Recognize and implement the qualities associated with effective business writing. So there's a consciousness of genre and the characteristics of particular genres in the field of business. Okay, they have some specific criteria that they're going to teach in the class, and then students are supposed to apply those. So the plain English characteristics and the 4 C's, which they're taught and then they're asked to apply. And then they're using that to revise documents, to maybe prepare new documents and apply these characteristics. So very clear criteria that the students are expected to not only learn, like acquire the knowledge, but also, apply the knowledge to new texts that are being created. Also plan, create, and complete business documents, and then they specify the genres that they're going to cover and then they specify the characteristics that they want to see in those documents. So it's a general description, but each genre, each type of writing has its own characteristic. So the characteristics of memos or blog posts, of proposals or reports. And they do specify some of the concrete things that they expect to see here. So those are linguistic, they're language in nature, but they're also very closely aligned to the content that these students will be studying. Now, these are English for specific purposes or writing for specific purposes type courses. So they're not exactly EMI. A lot of times they happen before a student goes into all English instruction, and so they're intended to be a preparation. And that means EMI might look a little different. EMI should contain, an instructional unit should contain both outcomes for language and outcomes for content. It may be difficult if you're a content instructor and you're trained in that tradition to identify the kinds of linguistic things that you can cover or should cover in your course or your lesson. And so I have 2 suggestions. The first one is to collaborate with a colleague who is a language teaching specialist And we're lucky, those of us who work at institutions where we have colleagues, trained like that. It's a resource that we definitely can take advantage of. And we can also use the Common European Framework descriptors as stems and ways of starting to build outcomes. And I'm going to walk you through a couple examples of doing that. So the Common European Framework descriptors are written as can-do statements. Students can do something. At this level, students characteristics that we need in language learning outcomes. So they need to be observable and measurable and accessible and relevant and aligned to our curriculum. And the diagram here kind of shows how all of that works together. So the language learner is working within a domain. The domain may be engineering, or it may be business, or anything else you can think of. And within that domain, there are activities that a practitioner in that domain needs to know how to do. A practitioner needs to know how to write a business memo or a research report, or needs to be able to give a proposal in an oral presentation. So they have tasks that they need to know. And in order to do those tasks, there are linguistic activities that are involved. So students need to be able to identify important ideas. They need to be able to construct an argument in English or the language of the context. And within those language activities, there are strategies that they should employ. There are things that they need to know. For example, subject-verb agreement in English, very fundamental to a lot of these language activities, and processes that they need to know. And so the Common European Framework is attempting to link like real-world behavior with the kind of things that students can do in order to perform that real-world behavior. And so I like to start with these Common European Frameworks because they're observable and they talk about real-world performances and characteristics, just like understanding by design expects, and just like we want our students to be able to do to be successful. So in order to use Common European Framework descriptors, there's a link at the very end of my document to an entire slide of Common European Framework resources. There are about 3 things there. One of them is the document that has a huge list of descriptors, illustrative descriptors is what they call them, for any English activity that you might be able to think up. And so when you do this, you can employ those, but you need to think about what your students need and where your students are. So I think assessing your students' proficiency in English would be a good first step, at least informally. Think about your curriculum and the kinds of things that, take place in the classes that you teach, the tasks your students do, and then choose from those descriptors the ones that are relevant to what you're doing in your instructional unit, in your course. You can't teach everything. You can't teach everything about English in your class. So you choose the things, just like we said before, going from the things that are nice to know to the things that are important to the things that are essential and like foundational. And you want to look for things that are foundational and very, very applicable. Also, these descriptors might not cover everything that you can think of. So you may not find something in there that you need, and you may have to write something of your own. It is pretty comprehensive, but it's not universal. So, and they all need to be adapted. So the way that these descriptors are written now, they're not written as learning outcomes. And so you'll need to adapt them and focus them in order to be able to turn them into usable outcomes. Here are some examples. And these are 2 things that I pulled from that big list of descriptors. One is for writing and one is for speech, and they both deal with the same kind of functions in English. So can interpret and present in writing the overall trends shown in simple diagrams. So students will be able to consult a diagram whether that's a bar chart or, a pie chart or some kind of flow chart. And they'll be able to write about it and identify what's important in English in the writing that they do. And because I chose level B1, that is an intermediate level, characteristic of a lot of students in EMI programs, although it's not, by all means, not the only level that's represented. I'm addressing students where they are here. I'm recognizing that they'll probably be able to get the main points, or they should be able to get the main points. They may need the assistance of some linguistic tools like a dictionary. They may not give a complete and detailed description. But this is a descriptor from the Common European Framework. It's not an outcome yet. We're going to make it an outcome. And then the same for speech. We have can interpret and describe detailed information in diagrams in his or her fields of interests. That would be the course you're teaching. Even though lexical gaps may cause hesitation or imprecise formulation. So this descriptor makes clear that students at a B1 level, they may not have impeccable grammar. They may not have the most precise vocabulary. You can help get them there. You can help move them toward that goal. But students at this level, this is what the expected level of performance is. So we have descriptors. And now let's think about how we can use these to develop outcomes for our class. Let's ask, for my class, for my course, in my field, what are the kinds of diagrams, charts, and graphs that are used? I can't answer that for you. It depends on your field. But you think about, what you know, and, those would be the kinds of diagrams that you would incorporate. So that's just for the sake of argument or the sake of example, say that bar charts are an important part of my particular field and my particular discipline. Then you think about, for those diagrams that I identified, what kind of language do I need to talk about those? So what kind of language do I need to talk about trends, increase, spike, decrease, plummet? So talking about trends, plateau. How do we talk about the measurements that are used? So things can be measured in terms of years, things can be measured in terms of distance, time. So how do we talk about those in English? We're starting to identify things that we can help our students to advance on. How do students talk about quantitative information? So how do they talk about numbers? Numbers can be very difficult. Discussing things quantitatively can be pretty challenging. And what features of diagrams are relevant? And so you think about that and you start to get a concrete idea of the language that's going to be involved in completing a task in English of this type. Okay, and so you can develop an outcome that starts with the descriptor from the Common European Framework, but becomes more specific. So students will be able to interpret and describe detailed information in bar charts by, then we have an observable verb, identifying the features, and then those features are listed very specifically in English, of course, because that's the language that I'm using now, but it's also there in the outcome so that when we plan, we know the things that we want to incorporate. And interpreting their contents. So students can identify the features and then interpret the content of those and what they mean. Either in writing or in speaking, you can specify. And then students are also going to be able to describe trends in the data using those terms that we kind of went over just a minute ago, using the appropriate vocabulary. And then there may be a series of target phrases that you want to make sure that your students are taught in the acquisition part of learning and then apply when they're doing their tasks. And so we've gone from something very general, which was that descriptor, and then this is an example of how it can be specific enough to fit within an instructional unit. Okay. And here's another example, which is from reading comprehension. So it's slightly different. And I'm going to go over it quickly because we're running out of time a little bit. But students will be able to understand short texts. Now, understand, that's one of those 16 verbs that we were told we shouldn't use when we write outcomes. So we know already we're going to have to choose something that's observable and measurable. So they understand short texts on subjects with which they are familiar, which should be something in your class, or current interest, in which people provide a point of view. So some kind of argumentative task or persuasive text. Can identify the main conclusions. This is also for B1, that are in clearly signaled argumentative text. Clearly signaled means that there's explicit language in the text that says, this is a premise, maybe not that particular word, but you know, this is my claim, this is the conclusion I reached, and we signal those linguistically in various ways in English. And students can recognize the line of argument in the treatment of the issue, although not necessarily in detail at level B1. So now we have kind of the destination in mind. Now, what is our objective going to be? Let's ask ourselves, what kind of argumentative texts are typical in our discipline? How are they structured? So what kind of language is used? What organization is followed in a typical example? And what specific English language content or phrases or vocabulary or grammatical structures or text structures are employed, because those are things that I can incorporate in my lesson. And so I might come up with something like this. Students will be able to interpret arguments in business memos. There's a specific text in my field in which people give their points of view. So they will be able to paraphrase. They'll read the memo. This is listening comprehension. So they'll read the memo. They'll be able to express the main conclusions in a paraphrased way. Paraphrasing is pretty challenging. They'll be able to describe the line of argument that is used by the memo, and they'll be able to identify the premises of the argument, the support of the argument, and the warrants of the argument. If they're going to do that, then that's going to be taught in your class. And that vocabulary, what is a premise, that's going to be used in your lessons. So those are objectives that have grown out of these Common European Framework descriptors. And they do require some modification. They do require your knowledge in order to create something useful. So let's look forward to assessment. Let's look ahead to where we're going to go with assessment. In backward design, we begin by identifying where we want our students to end up. And the second stage of backward design is deciding how do we know that they have gotten there. And that is assessment. And so not next week, but webinar number 5 in this series is going to deal completely with assessment. But here's a little bit of a taste of how these two are connected. So after you establish learning outcomes, you've got to think about assessment and what evidence will convince you that the student has mastered those learning objectives. And then think about, backward design, this is very important, what performance task is going to let students show that they've learned these things. Performance task means something that they're actually doing. It might not be an exam. In fact, a performance task frequently is not an exam. So when we ask these questions, if we're going to take our bar chart example again, students might do an oral presentation where they are either assigned a bar chart or they create a bar chart previously in another lesson, and then they describe it in English. They describe the characteristics of the chart, interpret what the data is, how it's represented on the chart, and they do that in an oral presentation. So that would be an assessment. That's a performance task that shows you that they have learned how to do those things. or for the business memo example, students would use a diagram or create a diagram, an argument diagram, where they have a business memo, and then in the diagram, they identify what are the premises for the argument that this author has used. Some of those they need to infer, and inferring in reading comprehension is a skill that can be taught. So identifying the premises, identifying the support, and identifying the warrants in addition to the conclusions, right? So those are linguistic things that students are doing, but they're showing you that they have learned those things by performing some kind of task. Okay, so the difference between evidence and performance tasks: evidence is any kind of assessment. So a performance task is, at the end of your unit, is not going to be the only assessment that you do. So you may give quizzes, you may give exams, you may give other types of assignments, and all of those help you understand how students are advancing toward their goal of mastering these outcomes, right? But a performance task is something specific. So it's authentic, ideally, as authentic as it can possibly be, given your context. It integrates and assesses several learning outcomes. So students are doing several different things in order to do this task. And all of those things come from the outcomes that you've identified. A performance task is a summative assessment. It's something that occurs at the end to help evaluate how far students were able to advance toward their goal of mastering these objectives. So you cannot do a performance assessment in each class, which is why Wiggins and McTeague talk about performance assessments being the end of an instructional unit, not the end of a lesson. And that's why planning is considered in terms of instructional units and not in terms of planning individual lessons, because the arc of an instructional unit can cover several class sessions. And so the performance task happens at the end. And usually those would be graded with rubrics. The rubrics would incorporate the learning outcomes, and then you would assess students' progress towards their meeting those outcomes. Okay, I'm not going to go over this because it is a little bit tangential, but one thing it does identify is that students' self-assessment can be part of the assessment that you do for the class. So the Common European Framework includes, and I think in the speaker notes I have a link to it, includes like a student self-assessment grids. So students can say, I can understand texts that consist mainly of high frequency words. I can understand the description of events. So I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. So on Fink's taxonomy of learning, you can see that this metacognitive ability to self-assess is one of the domains that's represented. So student self-assessment is something that you can think about incorporating. Okay. So my conclusions: EMI courses, they require both content and language outcomes. There are certain characteristics of well-written outcomes, and we've discussed those. And outcomes drive assessment. So the more clear they are, the more clear it is how assessment is going to occur. Writing language learning outcomes requires you to think about the language that's used in your discipline and in the course that you teach. So it does require thought. That requires time. So, and the descriptors from the Common European Framework are a helpful place to start if you need ideas of how to start teaching linguistic aspects of language of English in your class. And you can also consult colleagues who have more expertise in that area. They can also kind of help you identify and focus where you want to go with the language aspect of your EMI class. Okay, and then this is a link to the assignment. I won't go over it, but if you're in the workshop with me, we're going to talk about it tomorrow. And if you're not in the workshop with me, you're welcome to look at it and use it for your purposes. Our next webinar is October 21st, and it's going to cover EMI methodology, which is a little out of order in the backward design process, but I think it's important for us to consider at this point. So I usually close with some kind of quote or a poem, and I won't read this one to you, but it's another one that stuck with me over time, and it's the idea that we are only where we are in terms of our knowledge, our life knowledge, our knowledge of our professional careers and our areas. We're only there because someone helped us get there. Someone structured the path in front of us so that we would be able to advance beyond where we were before. And so it says, we were students then, water that once could take no human weight. We were students then, holds up our feet now. And beneath us are our teachers. So the support that our teachers, the structure that our teachers have provided, is the reason that we're able to be where we are now. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. I know I went a little over, so I apologize for that, but I'm ready for some more questions.
Hi, Julianne.
Hello.
Thanks for this wonderful presentation, and we'd like to thank you so much for that and invite everyone to the next webinar on October 21st. We're not having a webinar next week. It's going to be a kind of a long holiday in Brazil. So on October 21st at 5 p.m. It's going to be on Emi Methodology and planning learning activities. We're going to skip questions today just because we are ahead of time, but we can deal with that maybe next time.
Well,
it was
my email is on the slides, and I'll take a look at the Facebook comments and try to respond where I can.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Noemi.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you. See you in 2 weeks.